Hello, everybody. Steve here from The Varied Life, retired hobby tech guy. And unfortunately, we're talking about excessive force tragedy that recently happened in the state of New York, where a handcuffed inmate was killed by New York correctional officers. Yeah, you can say excessive force. Yeah, I am amazed at, since seeing this, especially since I worked in corrections in the state of Colorado for 11 years. I worked at medium restricted facilities, worked at territorial correctional facility, which is the oldest prison in the state of Colorado. That is a medium R facility. I've also worked at Fremont Correctional Facility, which is a medium R. So, in other words, you're going to have murders, rapists, gangbangers, the whole nine yards, sex offenders. And I've even done a little bit of work at CSP, which was their max prison there in the state of Colorado. Thankfully, I only had to do a couple tours there, did minimal work, but that's where the worst of the worst go for the state of Colorado. And to give a little bit of background on my training and about me, I joined the military when I was 17 years old on the delayed entry program, went into the military. I've worked infantry, military police, yada, yada, yada. I was an instructor, field artillery, communications, just did some cool stuff. Shoot, move, communicate, and in regards to how you deal with things in war. But on the military police side, you have to deal with the legalities of being police. And so you have to understand there's a whole different set of rules when you're a police officer versus being infantry and going to war. And there's a whole different mode of operations or policies that you have to follow. And one of those is use of force. It's pretty well defined in every state of the United States and most countries. But unfortunately, there are still places where it's not being enforced. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is up in New York, where these correctional officers beat and kicked this inmate and he ended up dying. It just shows this is a severe problem in New York, and unfortunately, it's just kind of crazy. So we're going to take a look at that. Some of my other background is also working in law enforcement. I was a firearms instructor, a self-defense instructor. I was part of a instructor contact team teaching military police at Fort Carson, Colorado, with arresting and so on and so forth, hand-to-hand combat, defensive measures, use of force continuum, teaching and training, and how far you can go when somebody does this. What is your response? And never to go from 0 to 100 unless the situation deems itself so. The totality of circumstances and everything. And when I saw this, what happened in New York with a handcuffed inmate, I was amazed. Now, I've already got some blowback on this, on some comments that I left because I said I hope that the family sues the state, sue all the inmates, sue the warden, sue the state correctional, sue the state of New York. I mean, there would be so many lawsuits that should be filed, in my opinion, if it was me. Now, the one thing that we need to take a look at is that, yes, this guy was an inmate. He did a lot of bad stuff. He was in prison. Okay, he's serving his time. So you could be the worst of the worst. You could be a baby raper. You could be a murderer. Whatever it is. But you are in prison to serve your sentence according to law. And when you are in prison, all states have the requirements to provide health, safety for the inmates that are there. So we're talking about medical care, we're talking about mental health, we're talking about food, nutrition, all of these things, and even to the point of where they are dictated by policy and law that they should not be assaulted for no reason. And so, in other words, there's this use of force continuum of what you can and can't do. And there's so many cases of where correctional officers have abused the use of force continuum, and it has resulted in them being charged and them going to prison. So there's tons of examples of this. But what we'll do is we'll take a look at this right here, and we'll start off and show you what is going on. So here is the footage.
with that investigation into the death of an inmate at a New York prison. The state attorney general's office releasing body camera footage today showing the beating that is being blamed for his death.
Fox 8's Morgan Mackay has been reviewing the incident. She joins us live from the newsroom. Morgan, more than a dozen correction officers were involved in this.
Bianca, Natasha, it's a tough video to watch. Robert Brooks died shortly after this alleged assault. His family has seen the videos, but due to the graphic nature of the body camera footage, Fox 5 has decided to only show images of part of this alleged beating.
These videos are shocking and disturbing, and I advise all to take appropriate care before choosing to watch them.
The state attorney general's office released this footage recorded on body cameras worn by 4 correctional officers at the Marcy Correctional Facility in central New York. These videos, which have no audio, show Robert Brooks being carried into the infirmary by correctional officers. Brooks's hands are handcuffed behind his back when officers start punching him. They then hoist him up by his neck very forcefully, and one officer starts to smack Brooks with a shoe. One officer then used his booted foot to kick and pin down Brooks. Another officer punched Brooks in his upper body, and one of the officers again punched Brooks while handcuffed. At one point, Brooks was sat up with his face bloodied, and an officer punched him again. Brooks was then pulled up by his collar and forced to the wall. The next part of the video, which we're not showing due to its graphic nature, shows Brooks being carried back to the table seemingly unconscious. Brooks died the following morning at a Utica hospital. No charges have been filed yet, but the incident is being investigated by several agencies. In court filings this week, state police investigators said that preliminary findings from the medical examiner's office showed asphyxia as a possible cause of death. Governor Kathy Hochul said she was outraged and horrified after seeing the video and ordered the Department of Corrections to fire the 14 employees who allegedly participated. A spokesperson for the department said that 13 of those involved have been suspended without pay and 1 resigned. Brooks was serving a 12-year sentence after being convicted of first-degree assault for stabbing a former girlfriend. Reverend Al Sharpton commended Hochul's swift action, but the incident sparked outrage among many elected officials and criminal justice advocates.
It's shocking, it shouldn't be, but it's just the manner, the way in which they did not care. They did exactly what they wanted to do without a care in the world.
Now, the New York State Correctional Officers and Police Benevolent Association, the union which represents most of those allegedly in the video, says they do not condone the actions taken in the footage, but will be upholding its obligation to represent its members. Natasha and Bianca.
Yeah, that is just absolutely crazy. And when we're talking about this, the part of the video, it shows like the one guy with his foot up in the air, kicking the inmate, kicking him in the groin. In all of the training that I received in the military, in military police, in the Colorado State Department of Corrections, and according to federal law, which is based on federal law and then state law, they all reaffirm the same thing. There is no state in the United States where that type of behavior of kicking an inmate in the groin is authorized. There is no training that is ever done to where you are to kick an inmate in the groin. There is never any training to where you are to hit a subdued inmate or suspect who is handcuffed and to beat them repeatedly. That is a prime example of what not to do. And unfortunately, what we see here is the videos it's pretty bad. It ends up that it's just absolutely crazy on what they ended up seeing. Let's see if we can find some better footage of this and see if we can't get this.
Today, my office is releasing video from the investigation into the death of Liability.
Now, here's something that we need to take into consideration. They do have body cams on, but the audio wasn't allowed, or they didn't put it on, which I find that highly suspect. But just think about this. This isn't a one-time thing where, oh, John was, he was really stressed out, and so he lost it, and this. No, this shows a pattern of behavior, and I will bet you $1 million that if you look into the history of these correctional officers, there will be reports of extended and extensive excessive use of force of these correctional officers, and because of their wanton aggressiveness. So let's take a look at this. So again, there's no, there's stuffing a rag down his throat, which is, let me just go ahead and stop that right there. There is, where is it? Right there. They're stuffing some type of rag down his throat. There is absolutely nothing that I have ever seen in my law enforcement time, in my time as a military police, in my 11 years of being in corrections, as working my way up to a lieutenant, that is ever authorized. Most states have spit masks, so if you have an inmate that is spitting on you and you don't know if the inmate has HIV or some other communicable disease that is contagious, they do have spit masks that they are issued to put over inmates' heads so they can't spit and assault on officers. The fact that they are stuffing a rag down that person's throat is, again, unjustified use of force. There is no reason whatsoever, especially since the inmate is handcuffed. I know it can be frustrating for people that have worked corrections. I've seen it myself, where inmates will run their mouths and they'll yell and scream and cuss and rant and tell you to go F your grandmother or whatever, that they're going to, F your grandmother and your wife and your daughter and kill them and whatever. You cannot lose your cool. You cannot lose your professionalism. And unfortunately, that's what ended up happening here, and to the point of where it's like, why is this guy shoving a rag down this guy's throat? There is zero policy for this in any state in the United States. There is clearly not, but you'll see training on spit masks or spit hoods and things like that, but never, ever, 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 ever are you supposed to shove something down the throat of an inmate, because that blocks the airway, and you're specifically trained not to cut off the airway or the blood flow that goes to the brain or reduces the amount of air intake. That's kind of like training 101 on use of force. That's one of the things that they tell you about, don't do chokeholds, don't do carotid, the carotid artery blocking and things like that, for the fact that that's going to either reduce airflow or blood flow. So those things are extremely prohibited in use of force training. So we continue on. Let's kind of just go through this and we'll hit this. So there he is. And we can see hitting him in the head. He's already restrained. The inmate is sitting down. He's handcuffed behind his back, and now they're hitting him in the head. There is no reason for this whatsoever. And if you look at the use of force continuum, which what we will end up doing, and some other policies and federal laws, kind of on use of force, it's all the same. Pretty much, you have the federal use of force laws and the continuum, and here's what you can and can't do, and the states just reaffirm that. And that is because there have been so many lawsuits of excessive use of force that the federal government and the state governments get their ducks in a row, and boom, that should fix the problem. Apparently, that doesn't fix the problem, because we have correctional officers that are like this. So we already see this guy's getting hit a few times. Maybe what we can end up doing is we can slow this down. Oh, it didn't have it on here. Okay, so he hit him again. Hitting him, this officer here is hitting him in the stomach. This officer here is hitting him in the face, and this officer is holding him down, which looks by his throat. And then you have this guy here. He's just kind of watching, and whoever's body cam this is, you can see the zipper of his coat, he's just watching. And we'll go into why this is also wrong. But yeah, there's absolutely no reason for this guy for any of these guys to do what they're doing. So again, there's some more hits, and yeah, seriously, really? That is just absolutely crazy. So we have this guy, Mr. Jackboot guy, and he's putting his boot onto the lower abdomen, which could be the groin, but, in use of force training and, when you handcuff an inmate or you have to restrain an inmate or a suspect or whatever it is, you're not taught to do anything like that because that can cause severe bodily damage to the groin, to the lower abdomen. It is not used for pain compliance. It is definitely not a technique that is taught, as far as I know, in any state correctional setting. So, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say, that is not something that they are trained to do. So we'll continue on. And the whole thing is, why is this guy doing this? He's already laid down. The guy wasn't kicking, but you're just going to go ahead and you're going to put your boot in his lower gut and his groin. So of course, when you kick somebody in the groin area, your legs are going to go up to try to protect yourself, and then this guy grabs his leg. This is not a de-escalation of the situation. It is an escalation of the situation, and it shows wanton disregard for this person, even though he's an inmate, but under the state of New York and any other state in the United States, this is not a viable technique to get control of an inmate because he's already handcuffed and controlled. This is just wanton violence and disregard for life. So there's the other guys punching him some more. These guys are just kind of like watching. You have those correctional officers. And here's another view. So they take him and they put him up against the wall, which you can actually see. Let's back it up a little bit here. And they pick him up, and then they push him against, and see how the bending of that. So I don't know what this is, but whatever it is, it was hard enough to bend whatever that was. And the fact that it's like, okay, well, why, if he's restrained and he's handcuffed and it looks like he's starting to go limp, why would you pick him up in that manner? That doesn't make sense either. And again, we have the majority of people just standing and watching. And then later it ends up that here's the guy, and obviously it's just absolutely crazy on what we see here. And the fact that everybody is so chill and nonchalant about this is very telling. It is absolutely insane that nobody ran in there and said, you know what, we need to stop this. This is enough. This is excessive force. We are actually taught in corrections where if you see excessive force happening, then you have an obligation, a duty by law to step in and stop that and report it to a supervisor. The fact that out of these 14 people that were there, nobody stepped in, nobody reported it. When you have somebody beating an inmate in their head and face, which is, again, not an authorized technique, because that rises to the level of lethal force. And we'll look into lethal force and when can you use lethal force. But there's no reason to do that to a subdued, handcuffed individual, which is absolutely crazy. So let's go ahead and we'll take a look at some of these things here. What is the use of force continuum? This is kind of interesting to provide an objective evaluation of whether a police officer's actions or a correctional officer's actions were responsible under the circumstances. It's a difficult job, and it goes on about the force continuum. Now, they have different levels of force continuum. So you have officer presence. And this is used as just like the officer just showing up, and so that it's a show of force that criminals or whatever, somebody who's like, they'll see a policeman there, and so, I'm not going to rob this store because the police are there. Verbal commands. This is when an officer or guard is there, and they have to use physical or verbal commands to tell somebody to stop, get away, don't do that. don't move, put your hands behind your head, whatever it is. And then we get into empty hand control. And all of these are predicated upon the point that you only use the necessary force to stop that person in the illegal activities of what they are doing. Committing a felony, posing a threat of immediate threat of serious bodily injury, or maybe lethal force against people or individuals other than the officer themselves. And it comes down to if it escalates beyond this, so the officer presence does not work, and then the officer gives commands and that does not work, and then you go to empty hand controls. There are two types of soft empty hand techniques, or hard, and soft is where you use like wrist joints, pain compliance, and things like that. Then you have hard empty hand techniques in order to de-escalate the situation. The latter requires kicks, slaps, or punches in order to subdue someone. But what's really important about this last one, on the hard empty hand techniques, is that you cannot use techniques, kicks, punches, or slaps to areas of the body that would cause damage or severe bodily injury or even death. And so that's why you were trained during correctional training and in law enforcement training that you cannot strike to the temple. You cannot strike to the throat. You cannot strike to the groin. There are other areas where it will just be excessive in relation to the totality of circumstances of what you're responding to. When you start getting into the soft empty hand techniques are good because you're talking about wrist locks, joint locks, things like that, pain compliance, where you can press, and there's certain areas of where you can, stop the thought activity and interrupt that nervous system to the point of where a personal pause that'll give you time to restrain and handcuff that individual. But there are some pain compliance techniques that don't work. And so if they don't work after one or two times, then you move on to the next one. And then if it still escalates, then you move on to the hard empty hand controls where you're talking about slaps and kicks. But when we're talking about slaps and kicks, we're talking about kicks to the common peroneal on the side of the leg. We're talking about, in the back of the calf and things like that. We're not talking about, striking the knee to break their kneecaps. That is actually not something that is taught, and it's actually taught that you should not do that. When it comes to joints and things like that, arm bars, it's not something that you should do. So, then we get to the less lethal options, and we're talking about includes the use of a baton, pepper spray, a taser, Fox 5, all those wonderful things that I've actually experienced in my life, because when you get trained in law enforcement and as a correctional officer and in security, we actually had to go through and we had to get tased. We had to get sprayed with OC. We had to get sprayed with Fox, which law enforcement carry. And that stuff is not good. And when we're talking about the use of the baton, they used to have the P24 sticks that the officers would carry, as kind of had like a little handle and whatever. Even the extendable batons that they had, there's only certain areas of the body that you can hit somebody with. And those are, again, the areas like the common peroneal. We're talking about the muscles, not on joints, because that can cause permanent damage. But we're talking about, hitting the muscle areas of certain parts of the body, so that way they're not able to complete the actions of what they're trying to do. The head is absolutely off limits. The neck is off limits. The groin is off limits, unless it comes to lethal force and you are fighting for your life. Now, again, the totality of circumstances comes into play here. Lethal force is an example of a lethal weapon of a firearm, but it can also be hard, empty hand techniques, or it could be using the baton in a way to put lethal force against somebody that is trying to inflict severe bodily injury or lethal force against yourself. So don't think that, a baton can't be used for lethal force. It actually is. And that's where I kind of disagree with this, based on decades of training in the military police, and law enforcement. It's the excessive force when it's talking about here at this I don't know this, but they do a pretty good job. Medical expenses, pain and suffering, mental anguish and humiliation, lost wage, loss of future earning capacity, punitive damages, attorney's fees. And this is going to be very problematic for these correctional officers and for the New York Department of Corrections. It's going to get really, really bad. When we talk about use of force, this is from the Glen Falls Police, but I can tell you right now, this graphic here is one of the graphics that's used in a lot of states. They just slap their name on it. So you have the officer's perception, and you have compliant, resistant, resistant active, bodily harm, assaultive, serious bodily harm and death, and then you have the officer's response. So cooperative controls, contact controls, of course, compliance techniques, which we talked about, the wrist locks and pain compliance, defensive tactics, assaultive, that's when we're going to use like the less than lethal, and then when you get up into deadly force, if you're being, your perception being that there is a requirement that I'm in fear for my life, my life or the lives of other officers, that I'm going to respond with this deadly force, then that could be seen as totally okay. Now let's think about this. In the case of the inmate that is handcuffed behind his back, sitting down on a gurney and trying to stuff a rag down his throat, where in this use of force continuum does this fall under? Absolutely none. And when we talk about, well, he's a spitter and a biter, he's one of those guys. That's why they have the spit hoods and the spit masks that they can put over his head. And I know New York has them. I've seen them use it, okay, in various videos. So, the fact that they end up trying to shove a rag down the inmate's throat, which is something you're not supposed to do in any way, shape, or form, because obviously the officer's perception, was he compliant? He's sitting on a gurney and he was handcuffed, and we'll get into the handcuff part. Was he being resistant, like passive resistance? So he's just sitting there and he's not doing what he's told? I don't know. They're holding him down, so that doesn't seem to be the case. Was he resisting? In the video that we saw, maybe before that he was, but since he's handcuffed, that's going to be very problematic. Was he assaultive? In other words, was he performing actions that was being assaultive to these other officers? Absolutely not. We see no situation in the video that we just watched of where that inmate was assaulting those correctional officers at that point in time. So the video that we saw, he wasn't being any of these things. And he definitely wasn't being assaultive with officers perceiving that he was going to, seriously bodily injury or death to other officers or themselves. But they decided to go ahead and they didn't use cooperative controls, no contact controls, no compliance techniques, no soft empty hand or hard, went straight to hard empty handed and went into not even defensive tactics. It was just straight to deadly force because they were aiming the punches at his head, aiming at the parts of the body like the lower abdomen and the groin that would cause permanent damage. And again, there is no reason because it was not justified. Now, if the inmate wasn't handcuffed and he had already beaten up a couple of officers and he was actively whooping ass on one of the guards, then there would be that. It would be like, okay, well, he's trying to beat this guy to death, so I'm going to do what I need to do to get him to stop that. To respond to lethal force, I can use lethal force. But he had no way of doing that. Excuse me. So yeah, it just gets really crazy. The state of New York Division of Criminal Services and their use of force, a model policy. We're going to go through this, and the purpose is basically to provide what is good, what is bad, what you can and can't do, and we're going to go over some of this. Objectively reasonable, an objective standard used to judge an officer's actions. Under this standard, a particular application of force must be judged through a perspective of a reasonable officer facing the same set of circumstances without the benefit of 2020 hindsight, based on the totality of facts or circumstances that are known to the officer at the time that the force was used. Yeah, this is going to get really interesting here. Physical deadly force, physical force which under the circumstances which it is used is readily capable of causing death or serious physical injury. And again, we talked about these things. It's kind of standard through all the states and federal is that you don't hit the temples, you don't hit the face, you definitely don't block the airway when they were trying to shove a rag down his throat. And again, strikes to his groin and lower abdomen, you're not supposed to do stuff like that when there was no call for deadly force to begin with. Physical injury, impairment of physical condition or substantial pain, serious physical injury, which creates a substantial risk of death or causes death, or serious protracted disfigurement, protracted impairment of health, or protracted loss or impairment of function of any bodily organ. So kicking the groin, lower abdomen, yeah, that serious physical injury. And because they struck the head, this could be deemed as physical force, lethal force. In all of this, it needs to be objectively reasonable under the circumstances. And when we go down here, factors may be used in determining the reasonableness of the use of force, but not included the severity of the crime or circumstance. The severity of the circumstance. He was handcuffed, he was subdued, and he was sitting on a gurney in the video we saw. Now, we didn't see before, so that's still out there. But if he is handcuffed, regardless of what he did before, that does not mean that these officers are free to beat this inmate. The level of immediacy of threat or resistance posed by the suspect, this right here, he's handcuffed and he was sitting down. Obviously, he's not a threat. And if he's doing passive resistance, as we saw in the use of force continuum, there is no reason to go from, if he's doing passive resistance, so he's just sitting and he's not, they tell him to get up, move over here or whatever, he's just doing passive, then they can do contact controls. In other words, they can pick him up and move him from one place to another without beating him to death. Absolutely crazy. Potential for injury to citizens, officers, and suspects. There was no potential because he was handcuffed. The risk or attempt of the suspect to escape. He had 14 people there and probably some medical staff. He was handcuffed, yeah. Knowledge, training, and experience of the officers comes into play. Now, I will tell you, as somebody who worked in a Department of Corrections for 11 years and rising to the rank of lieutenant, is that newer officers are not as well trained as older and seasoned officers. With that being said, there can be some leniency because when you get into a use and force engagement and a new officer is wet behind the ears, brand new, they can do things that they were not trained to do because you get that adrenaline, the whole 9 yards. It's their first time maybe into a fight or an altercation in their entire lives. So they don't really know how to react and they just react in the wrong manner. But again, that comes with training and again, a very active training component that should be in law enforcement and corrections. The officer consideration is age, size, relative strength, skill, injury, exhaustion, number of officers or subjects. This comes more into play because, like, if you had an inmate, like I'm 260 some odd pounds, I'm 6'2", and I'm pretty built. If I was an inmate and I was confronting and getting into a tussle or an assault with an officer who was 5'5" and weighed maybe 155 pounds, who was brand new on the job and was a female, didn't have a lot of physicality with that person, whether they're male or female, that also comes into play. And that comes into the perception of, okay, for me as a correctional officer, 6'2", 260 some odd pounds versus a correctional officer who's 5'5", we might perceive threats differently just because we know the limitations because of our age, our stature, physical capabilities, and so on and so forth. other environmental conditions or exigent circumstances. In this case, there were no exigent circumstances for the fact that he was already handcuffed. When we talked about this, they already basically fired or pulled these guys from their job. What is it? 13 were fired, 1 resigned. The fact that they were all, 1 resigned and the rest of them were fired shows and reaffirms this duty to intervene, which is important. Any officer present and observing another officer using force that he or she reasonably believes to be clearly beyond that which is objectively reasonable under the circumstances shall intercede to prevent the use of unreasonable force or excessive force, if and when the officer has a realistic opportunity to prevent harm. As we watch this video, was there an opportunity for this to happen with the 14 officers were there? We saw the one holding him down by his neck. We saw the one officer off to the inmate's side that was punching him in the head, the other officer that was punching him in the stomach, and the one that was kicking him in the groin and the lower stomach. What about all the other officers that were there or staff? Because medical staff are also required. They have a duty to intervene in situations like this as well. An officer who observes another officer use force that exceeds the degree of force as described in subdivision A of this section should promptly report these observations to a supervisor. So not only do you have a duty to intervene and stop the excessive force, you also have to report it. The fact that nobody reported this and they all got fired, that means they were all derelict of duty. And it showed depraved indifference. And you look up depraved indifference, and it means that you were so depraved in mind that you just sat back and let that happen. This is akin to, watching a child get beat, seeing a baby getting raped. You have a duty to intervene, and even though this person was an inmate who did some pretty horrible things in their life, that does not negate the fact that they're immune from these use of force continuum. And it's like, oh, well, he's an inmate and he committed crimes and he did whatever. Even if he murdered a ton of people, under the state and federal laws, that is not justified for the excessive use of force that we ended up seeing here. So talks about use of deadly force. And this is interesting because a lot of what I saw in this, based on my training in corrections, shows that what they did was deadly force. Closed hand to the head, to the neck, kicking the groin, so on and so forth, trying to stuff a rag down his mouth. That's tantamount to torture, and that is lethal force because you're blocking the airway, and as we've seen other cases. Deadly force may be used to stop a fleeing suspect. Was he fleeing? No. The officer has probable cause to believe the suspect has committed a felony involving threat and serious injury or death. Nope, because he was already handcuffed. The officer believes the suspect poses an imminent threat or physical injury to the officers or others. Nope, that didn't meet it there. Where feasible, some warning should be given prior to the use of deadly force. Now, there was no audio on this, but from going through the video, I can't see where there was any warnings giving, which is also very problematic because when we're talking about corrections and training, you just don't whoop up on inmates for no reason. The only reason that you use force is to get compliance. And part of the probably one of the largest components of correctional training is to give loud verbal commands. So officer presence, and then when we get into loud verbal commands, and as you go into soft, empty hand controls or hard, or you start getting into less lethal devices or even lethal force, we are taught at every stage of that force continuum to give loud verbal commands. Stop what you're doing. Put the knife down. Stop beating her. Lay down on the ground. Put your hands behind your head. Whatever it is, loud verbal commands. So that is associated with the technique that if they don't follow those loud verbal commands, then you use the appropriate force necessary to get them to stop what they're doing to comply. if he's already been handcuffed and he's sitting on a gurney, and it looks like he had been whooped on before, but that's beside the point, I don't see loud verbal commands. I don't see verbal commands. And it makes me wonder why they didn't turn on the audio portion of their cams. I think that is very problematic in itself, and I think that would be an obstruction of justice. Chokeholds or obstruction of breathing or blood circulation. Any application of pressure to the throat, windpipe, neck, or blocking the mouth or nose of a person in a manner that may hinder breathing, reduce intake of air, or obstruction of blood circulation is prohibited unless deadly force is authorized. This is huge. This is against the law. This on a federal level and on a state level. These guys, these correctional officers this could be very, very bad. It should be very, very bad for them. And the fact that they were immediately terminated and one immediately resigned shows that, yeah, they all know what's going on. It's going to be very problematic. And all of this is taught. Now you might be saying, okay, well, what are the how often are these officers taught? There is ongoing and concurrent training for correctional officers every single year. And there's actually an organization that goes around to all the states to certify their prisons that they meet a certain level of standards, federal standards. And yeah, we would get inspected every few years. But every single year, you have X amount of hours that you have required and mandatory training, and use of force is one of those things. And they'll go through all of this and more with going to extreme details and examples of here's what this officer did. They'll show videos, and obviously he or she shouldn't have done that. And you just get inundated. It is drilled into your skull time and time and time again through the required training that you do every single year. It's a requirement to be on a correctional officer. You have to have this training. If you don't, you can't work in the proximity of inmates unless you have completed your training. At least I know that for the state of Colorado, and according to some buddies that I had that worked in New York, Louisiana, Florida, California. Yeah, no, it wasn't California. That you had to have your training hours up to date. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to work with inmates in a correctional facility. So that's why there's a big thing that you always get your training done. Prohibited use of force to extract an item from the anus or vagina of subject without a warrant, except with exigent circumstances, to coerce a confession from a subject in custody, to get blood, saliva, cells for testing in lieu of court order against persons who are handcuffed. What was that? Prohibited use of force. No force shall be used by an officer for the following reasons against persons who are handcuffed, restrained, unless it is used to prevent injury, escape, or otherwise overcome active or passive resistance posed by the subject. Definitely no lethal force should be used. And was he restrained? Was he handcuffed? Oh yeah, he was handcuffed. Was he injuring any of the officers during any time in that video? No. Was he before? Possibly. But the fact that he wasn't actively doing it during the video portions that we saw, that does not warrant them to beat him and kick him and choke him and obstruct his airway. He wasn't trying to escape. He wasn't actively assaulting anybody. Passive resistance, we don't know because I don't think so, because I can't read lips, but I don't see where they're like trying to stand him up and he just kind of flops down in that resistance and just kind of like a toddler who's throwing a tantrum. He's not doing that. He's sitting down and, they're trying to stuff a rag down his throat and then they put him down on the gurney. I don't think that's passive resistance. It's not like they were telling him that he needed to lie down. And I don't know, even if it was, there's nothing in the training manual or policies in the state of New York or any state or federal that I know of where shoving a rag down an inmate's throat and beating him in the face and lower abdomen and groin is appropriate use of force. I just don't see that. And again, we talk about, reporting what you saw, and that you have to do complaints and incidents and all of this stuff. Just absolutely crazy. When we go back here, it talks, when does police use of force become excessive? And we've already talked about a lot about this. It talks about the use of force continuum here. Let me make myself a little bit smaller. Understanding hitting or kicking a suspect in the face. This is indeed excessive force. And that was taught at the Department of Corrections. It was taught while I was in the military. It was taught when I was a firearms instructor and self-defense instructor, shooting an unarmed suspect. That actually, you can do that, and it wouldn't be considered excessive force if he's like trying to choke and kill somebody. Again, it's a totality of circumstances. Using pepper spray on a subdued individual, legal chokeholds, beating a suspect after handcuffing them. Yeah, that's excessive force. And if we're talking about the totality of circumstances, there's nothing there. It's not like he was kicking officers trying to be Jackie Chan with his, handcuffed and whirling around and, spin kicks. He wasn't doing that at all. The only time that the inmate ended up using his legs is when the guy stomped on his crotch and he brought his knees up to protect himself. There's no clear-cut definition of excessive force under law, because you're looking at the totality of circumstances, a lot of different variables when it comes to officer training, experience, and so on and so forth. But when you're getting trained every single year and you get massive training before you go on the job as a correctional officer, yeah, it's pretty crazy. One of the unique factors in police brutality cases, and this also applies to correctional officers, is qualified immunity. It is a legal doctrine that protects certain government officials from personal liability for constitutional violations. Qualified immunity is not limitless. However, it will not protect the police from constitutional violations, or correctional officers, that result from violations of clearly established law. And yeah, that's what we end up seeing here. So basically what ends up happening, as a correctional officer, I have been involved in use of force, in a lot of stuff. And I have been actually complained about because of my use of force against inmates. But when you look at the circumstances, I restrained an inmate from beating up another inmate. And it got to the point of where I used the least amount of force necessary to subdue this inmate. He claimed that it wasn't. And after review, it was thrown out. It wasn't a big deal. But because I followed the policies and the laws and the use of force continuum, and I didn't use excessive force, I followed the policies, so I was found guiltless. I didn't break any laws or policies, so I was able to have my qualified immunity, and the state and the legal eagles for the Department of Corrections and everything, they stood behind me and said, yes, he did everything according to policy, so he cannot be sued. He can't, he did everything correct, 100%, so it was thrown out. That's when we're talking about qualified immunity. Now, the problem is when we look at qualified immunity, which correctional officers and officers have, if you step outside the bounds of departments and federal laws and so on and so forth with constitutional violations, illegal search and seizures, life, limb, beating people up, you are walking out of qualified immunity because you're going out from under that umbrella by doing things that are not policy. And so for each and every one of these officers that assaulted that inmate, they're going to lose their qualified immunity. Based on the video that we saw, hands down, there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Now you can say, well, before the video, he was doing A, B, C, D, and E, but it doesn't matter. Because now he's restrained, he is handcuffed, he wasn't actively assaulting, anybody. And so why do they feel the need to stuff rags and assault him and hit him in the head and the groin and so on and so forth, holding him down by his neck, pulling him up by his neck? Never, never, ever, ever there's no policies in any state in the entire United States or the federal policies that says lifting an inmate by his neck is an appropriate response. Never, never, ever, ever, ever. So they will lose their qualified immunity, and that's just going to be, it's clearly established. This is going to be absolutely crazy. The New York governor orders the firing of 14 prison workers after fatal attack on the inmate, which is an absolutely 100% good call because what they did was severely egregious. They directed the 14 workers at a state prison to be fired, where they allegedly involved in an attack that resulted in the death of an incarcerated man. Robert Brooks, 43, died in a local hospital after the incident on December 9th. And the decision to initiate the firing process of 13 correctional officers. And there were some medical people there, so I'm wondering what's going to happen with that because they have a duty to care as well, and they didn't. Her decision came after an internal review of the incident, which there is videos being reviewed by prosecutors. We have no tolerance for individuals who cross the line, break the law, and engage in unnecessarily violence or targeted abuse. And I totally agree with that. I'm committed to accountability for all that's involved. Now, I will say, as a correctional officer, as a guard, and as an officer, a lieutenant in the Colorado Department of Corrections, that what they did was 100. They all need to be fired. They all need to be charged. They all need to go to court, and they need to serve some time for what they did. The state should be sued, but the problem is that this isn't a one-time thing. When you look at their behavior, it's not like okay, well, I don't know what to do, so I'm just going to hit him in the face. Oh, I don't know what to do, so I'm going to shove a sock down his throat. No, these were pre-planned and premeditated, and this shows that they have done this before. I will bet a paycheck that at least one of these officers, probably more, have been engaged in a number of lethal force or excessive force reports against them on other inmates. So in other words, this isn't a first-time thing. Oh, well, John, he just, he's going through a divorce, and so he just, took it out on the inmate. And Fred, he's having problems, with his girlfriend, and so that's why he shoved a sock down the inmate's throat. And the other guy, well, he had a lot of bills and stuff, and he's having problems with this, and that's why he stomped the inmate who was handcuffed in the groin. No, this isn't a coincidence that all of these things happened the very first time, at this moment in time. This is a clear example that there has been a pattern of excessive uses of force with these individuals, and the fact that the officers that didn't intervene just kind of stood back and watched it all happen shows that there's a pattern and there's an atmosphere that advocates of not following the policy. And so if you dig there, I bet you a paycheck that there is a ton of use of force, excessive use of force problems going on in the state of Colorado in this facility. Additional suspensions may be issued. I denounce their actions in strongest terms. I absolutely agree. There's no place for brutality in our department, and will vigorously pursue justice against the individuals who committed this senseless act. And I 100% guarantee you that. They'll make for the footage. Law enforcement professionals are held to the highest standards of accountability, and I'm committed to providing New Yorkers with the transparency that they deserve. The problem is what we see is that what I see, in my opinion, is this has been an ongoing problem, and then they slap the hand of people, and yet it keeps happening. It keeps happening. If you look at New York and the use of excessive force, there's a pattern of behavior that shows that, yes, they hold their officers accountable, committed to providing transparency that they deserve, yada yada yada. But unfortunately, what happens isn't getting fixed until it rises to a national level, to where somebody dies. Again, I would bet a paycheck that there are a lot of excessive force reports going on with these officers and others in this prison and probably other prisons in the state of New York that are just not being dealt with because they are not being held accountable for their actions. They're only being held accountable for their actions because what they did resulted in the death of an inmate and they got caught. If it was really to be held to the highest standards, you wouldn't be having this problem as much as we see in the state of New York. And unfortunately, we see this in a lot of other liberal states as well. It was more prevalent in, back in the day, but now that there's been prison reforms and laws and lawsuits and so on and so forth, we get to the point of where it's not the correctional officer's job to punish and beat up the inmates as part of their punishment of being in prison. Their punishment is being in prison. Your job as a correctional officer is to babysit and keep them from playing their games, catch them doing drugs or whatever it is, and stop them from hurting other officers or other inmates and having them serve their time. And in doing that, provide the safety for all the inmates and all the officers so the focus can be on rehabilitation rather than beating them unjustifiably. It just doesn't make sense. The union that represents correctional workers said in a press release that some members of their executive board have watched the footage of the incident, and what we witnessed was incomprehensible to say the least, and not reflective of the great work of the vast majority of membership conducts every day. This incident only endangers our entire membership but undermines the integrity of our profession. Yeah, it does. I agree with that. But again, the union should be the one that is pushing for concurrent training. It should be calling for the accountability to the point of where, yeah, we're going to hold our officers accountable, even in the small excessive uses of force and not just in the big ones. I'm just saying. In a press release, the New York Civil Liberties Union said Brooks' death is not an isolated incident. Imagine that. What did I say? Rather, it highlights a culture of violence, a lack of accountability for wrongdoing by correctional officers. It puts the lives of incarcerated New Yorkers at risk. And again, I would absolutely say that. The Correctional Association of New York, a prison oversight organization empowered by state law, says it's a good start, but governor and the legislation must go further. They need to take bold, courageous actions to fulfill past commitments and bring a new era of transparency and accountability in the state government. I think it comes down to where it needs to be applied in all cases of excessive force, and there needs to be that level of professionalism. The problem is when we talk about working in corrections is that, to be honest, nobody grows up and says, I want to be a prison guard. Nobody. I spent 11 years in Colorado Department of Corrections. No one ever says that they want to grow up and be a correctional officer. It's just not something that happens. What happens is that people can't find any other job that has good pay and good benefits. It's a sucky job, but the benefits are pretty good, compared to other things. And that's why I ended up working in corrections. There was a downturn in the market. Jobs weren't really, I couldn't get a well-paying job with good benefits. I didn't want to work at fast food. And with my time in the military and law enforcement and all that stuff, and as a firearms instructor and self-defense instructor, it was like, yeah, I need a job. And corrections is the easiest job around based on my experience. It's a no-brainer. But it's not something that I sought after. And when I went through the basic training for being a correctional officer, there was a couple other vets, but the majority of my class, which had like 50 or 60 people or so, somewhere around there, 50 or 60, the majority of the people, a lot of them were dumb as a bag of hammers. You had people that had, it was just, it was cringy. It was severely cringy. But if you could breathe and you could pass a test where they teach you the answers basically, and then if you fail, you get retrained on what those answers were again, wink, wink, knock, knock. You probably need to write this down. And then you take the test again, and then if you fail it a third time, there's some people I know that took tests that should have never been able to take tests multiple times. Basically, instructors hang you over them. They're like, I actually saw that, where an instructor was retesting a student, and the person would start to mark down on the little bubble thing, and there's, and then the person would move their pencil to the next, and then they move to the next bubble, and it's like quiet. So the person started filling in the bubble. Yeah, it's unfortunately, yeah, that's what I ended up seeing. But the majority of people there are not equipped to be correctional officers. They don't have the social, people who are socially awkward. A lot of people are correctional officers. You have people that, unfortunately, they don't have a lot of common sense. They end up being correctional officers. You have people that came from severely dysfunctional families. I did. But they can't follow the rules or the policies that are put into place. Those people go into corrections. And those are the people, you have the people that got a chip on their shoulder. You have the people with the Napoleon syndrome. The big little man thing. I'm little, and so I'm going to take it out now that I have a badge. I'm going to take it out on all these people because I'm backed by the state of Colorado or whatever state that they're working for. I've seen that a lot. And then there's people that just want to be power hungry but don't know how to wield the power and don't care how they treat other people, even if they are inmates or even officers. Absolutely crazy. So, but the fact is the state of Colorado has done a good job at doing concurrent training and getting to the place of where the stories that I heard when I started working in corrections of just beating up inmates for no reason and tossing their cells and trashing everything and throwing their Bibles or their Qurans in the sink to get wet and just trashing everything has gone from that to a place of where we need to be respectful of people's stuff, and that it's not our job to beat and assault and even verbally abuse inmates. That's not in our job description. So Colorado has done a lot. I'm not saying they're better than any other state, but it still needs to do a lot better. But again, the quality of people that are hired in the Department of Corrections are people that made me seriously wonder if I needed to quit, because there was so many cases of people that would abuse inmates. There's so many cases where staff were compromised by inmates, and even just amongst the staff themselves, staff were doing staff, in other words, having sex, even though they were married, and this person's married, and this one's single, and this one's not. This one's a single mother, had a couple of kids, and so they're screwing anything that moved, inmates and staff alike, in even on duty hours. And everybody knew, but nobody's reporting everything. And if you report something, then you're a troublemaker. So there was still a lot of that going on. But over the years, over the 11 years I served, it had gotten better. But again, the basic qualifications is for somebody that can breathe and have a few brain cells popping around inside their head. But when we're talking about doing effective corrections, you need to have somebody who has common sense. You need to have somebody that can be logical, critical thinkers, can evaluate situations, and a lot of people in corrections just aren't that. I'm sorry, but they're going to hire what they can, but the turnover rate, and the reason that this happens is because the turnover rate in corrections is massive. It's over 50%, and I think in Colorado it was like 55, 57%. So over 50% of the people that get hired as correctional officers end up quitting. And so you get a new batch of, whoop-de-doos coming in, wackadoos and potatoes to become correctional officers, and for whatever reason, they leave and work fast food or, whatever, trying to do whatever it is. But yeah, absolutely crazy. So yeah, it just let's see. Here we go. I didn't read the bottom of this. So this, it says Brooks points to a report release about monitoring the Marcy Correctional Facility in 2022. It says that according to their interviews with people incarcerated at the facility, 80% witnessed or experienced abuse, 70% reported racial discrimination. Now, with that being said, as having worked in corrections, they will do surveys. They did surveys in the Colorado Department of Corrections, and you'll have people that will say, oh, yeah, well, Officer so-and-so did this, this, and this. And you can go back and watch the videos. Just no, he followed all the policies and he restrained you and did this. So some inmates will exaggerate, but the fact that it's 80%, that is huge. That is really a huge number. And 70% reported racial discrimination. That is a huge number. Those are huge numbers. According to their press release, one person interviewed at Marcy Correctional told them physical abuse is rampant. The correction officer told me when I got here, this is a hands-on facility. We're going to put hands on you if we don't like what you're doing. I've actually heard that, unfortunately, early on in my career, but it was from older correctional officers. And there was actually officers that got walked out because of excessive use of force. But they weren't really walked out. They were just like encouraged to retire or resign. This incident has the potential to make our correctional facilities even more violent, hostile, and unpredictable than than ever before. And this is very problematic because when you have this hands-on, anything goes policy, unwritten policy to go against the policies that you're supposed to be following, it's taken away from the rehabilitation aspect of the prison, which is the main job of the prison, and now you're being as violent as the inmates. And so do you think they're going to be rehabilitated? Do you think they're going to be acceptive to rehabilitation when you have rampant violence and excessive uses of force? No, probably not. It's only going to exacerbate the system. And then you'll get a higher recidivism rate, the rate at which people who have committed crimes go to prison, go out, and return, that will be higher when you have a ill-run correctional facility. It's just absolutely crazy on what's going on here with that. But yeah, absolutely crazy on when we're talking about corrections, when we're talking about law enforcement and use of force. I left some comments on Facebook on an article that showed this and talked about this and had little snippets of the video. And I said, I hope all the officers get sued. I hope the state is sued into bankruptcy. And then people kind of took it the wrong way because they're like, oh, so you think that the taxpayers, the taxpayers are going to pay all this. Yeah, the taxpayers should pay this. And it's actually the fault of the taxpayers. Now, hold on, don't get mad at me. But the taxpayers and the voting citizens have not enabled or held the elected officials' feet to the fire to enforce the policies and standards, and that's why we're in this situation. Then the state should be found liable, and they should be sued. And if they go bankrupt, whose fault is it? Ultimately, it comes down to the people who voted these people into office or allowed these people to stay in office and not enforce the accountability and the standards and the rules of conduct that law enforcement and correctional officers are supposed to follow. So don't get up on your high horse and think, oh, well, the taxpayers are going to pay for it, so you're wrong. No, it's absolutely wrong. I'm absolutely right in the fact that the citizens should have been wanting accountability and following the policies and the laws to begin with so that we wouldn't be in this situation. So yeah, if they sue the state or the city or town or county of Marcus, whatever the hell the place was, it's I hope they sue the Marcy, facility in Marcy, New York, and the New York State Department of Corrections. I hope it's a huge giant lawsuit. I hope that they win. But here's the other thing: they also have insurance, but again, that's paid for by taxpayers. But the fact that they don't do the job that they're supposed to do, and they allow this type of behavior, and they only want to correct it and be accountable and transparent when it results in the death of an inmate, but anything under that, we're not going to deal with that, there needs to be some repercussions. And so, by saying, oh, you just want to, it's only going to punish the taxpayers. You know what? I think taxpayers do need to be on the hook for this, because they are the ones who allow people to be in office. They allow, and that's some of the things I think it's very problematic. It's the people that empowers the government. But we've come to a place in our time where the people don't care anymore. And so they only get up in arms when then there's a huge case like this, but all the other excessive use of force cases, which I bet, and we'll see it with these other correctional officers that have done this thing, there will be a pattern of behavior and reports showing that they've had a lot of excessive force in the past. Why was policy not enforced on them? Why are they still allowed to be correctional officers? Kind of like the police officers that were engaged in excessive force and they get fired, and then they go work for another law enforcement agency and another department, and it ends up, when you look over the culmination of their career, it's nothing but littered with problems and excessive force. But instead of cutting it off and saying, yeah, should never work in law enforcement again, the system allows, or the people allow the system to be like this. If the people would rise up and vote and actually hold their elected officials' feet to the fire, we wouldn't have as many problems like this. So, yeah, there it is. Yeah, I hope the family sues. And even though he was an inmate and he did bad things, there's nothing, absolutely true, 100%. And he was in prison for the job, the things that he did, but it's not the job of the correctional officers in any state of the United States or any of the territories of the United States to beat an inmate in the head, shove rags down their throat, hold them down by their neck, stomp on their genitals and their groin area, lift them up by their neck. It's just not, a thing anywhere, state or federal, anywhere. So the fact that this happens in the United States is just, it's appalling to me. And again, will any amount of justice or legal lawsuit and settlement make up for the loss of that person, that loved one, even though they were a criminal? No. The fact that he had to undergo that, and the fact that the officers were not professional enough to say, hey, whatever he did before we saw the cameras rolling, he was restrained and he was being compliant. He was sitting, it's not like, he was trying to kick people or anything. It's just not good, But the fact that they allowed this type of behavior to continue at this facility, that this is common practice, and then it eventually escalated to, so in other words, they did, little excessive force here, a little excessive force there, a little bit more here, a little bit more there. So in other words, they grew accustomed. The staff and the leadership of that prison allowed this behavior to happen and this atmosphere to continue to the point of where it's escalated to the point into the death of an inmate. Just shows you how corrupt and how bad it is. So, I imagine there will be a lot of lawsuits, and rightly so. So anyway, that's what I'm looking at here. I know it's absolutely crazy, and I've been running my mouth for a long time. But when we're talking about use of force, when we're talking about inmates and working corrections, and like I said, I worked corrections for 11 years. And then I got out of prison, finished working because there was too much stress, probably the best decision I did. I came back to the two prisons that I'd worked at, and I did prison ministry for a couple of years because I saw that there was a need for prison ministry and to help in the rehabilitative process. That's how much I believed in it. So, and there's a lot of great guys in prison. There's a lot of great guys in prison who did horrible things, and they know that they've done horrible things. But again, regardless, you need to follow the policy. And what these officers did was so far outside of the realm of following policy, it's not even funny. Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see. And the duty to care, no one stopped, no one intervened, you know, from Joe stomping on this guy's groin or hitting him in the head or shoving a sock down or, you know, some rag down his throat. That somebody should have just immediately stepped in and said, whoa, 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 whoa. And actually, I got a little story to tell you, is that I was trained by some very good correctional officers, some old-time correctional officers, and they told me that they had this little catchphrase, that if they saw a fellow staff member getting to the point of where they're going to be using excessive force or lose their professionalism and get in trouble because they were too emotionally involved, unrestrained, maybe they had a bad day or whatever it was, and they're taking it out on the inmate, that a staff member would go up to that person and say, hey man, your wife called, she says it's an emergency, you know, or your son or daughter called, you need to take this phone call right now. And that was kind of the key phrase, kind of like the safe phrase of saying, hey, what you're doing is fucked up and you need to remove yourself from the situation. And it allowed the staff member to save face. Because instead of saying, hey, you're not supposed to be treating this guy this way according to policy A, B, C, and D, which is technically correct, you're able to say, hey, you've got an important phone call from your family, you need to go right now. And then you remove the inmate and that staff member who is losing their professionalism, losing their shit, remove them from that situation, and now somebody who's more level-headed can step in and do that. And that was probably an awesome lesson that I learned. Because there's always somebody there. In the case, there was 14 people there and medical staff. And not one of them stepped in and said, hey, you know, John, you got an emergency phone call? You just lie your ass off. Hey, I got to call the associate warden, or the warden needs to talk to you ASAP right now. Warden, or, you know, or shift commander, or whatever it is, to stop what he was doing. That's what should have happened. But nobody did. And I have actually used that technique on people that I have been working with in the Colorado Department of Corrections, because they lost their professionalism, they lost their moral compass, they lost sight of the policies that they were supposed to follow, and I've had to go up and physically put my hand on staff as they were dealing with an inmate inappropriately and say, hey, you got an emergency phone call, you need to go right now. And of course, the guy's thinking, family, something's wrong with my family, because the only time you get an emergency phone call is when it deals with family. You know, something seriously bad has happened. So that, boom, he immediately, oh, okay. And we start going off, and we get up far away from the situation. And I had to tell the guy, people who were senior to me in the Department of Corrections, and I had to say, hey, and it's like, well, what's going on? And, you know, I need to get to a phone and blah, blah, blah. And I get them like into the admin area outside of the cell houses, get them into the admin area and say, hey, I just had to pull you aside because what you were doing, you know, it wasn't going to go well for you. And there's no point in losing your job, losing your retirement, and losing your benefits for acting unprofessionally and losing your shit, which everybody does from time to time. And so when I told this guy this, and he was older than me, and he was actually, I was, what was I at that time? I was a lieutenant. Yeah, I was a lieutenant at that time. I think he was a sergeant, but he had way more years than me. He was getting close to retirement. And he was pissed, but then he had kind of settled down enough that he's like, you know what? He came up to me later and he told me, he says, yeah, what you did was good, and I appreciate that. That's the type of people that you need. You need the type of people that will accept and say, hey, I need to remove myself from this situation, and then later come back and recognize, yeah, I shouldn't have acted that way. I shouldn't have done that. I appreciate that. And I would want somebody to do that with me. That's the type of correctional officers that you should have, because you're protecting staff and you're protecting the inmates at the same time. and everybody gets to go home. So anyway, yeah, for the people that are like ragging on me, I actually had one person say, you don't know, because I said, it's manslaughter, it's assault, it's battery, and a couple other things, which clearly it was. I had one person that says, no, you don't know Colorado, or you don't know New York penal law. And it's like, there is no state in the United States, or even in federal jurisdiction, where assaulting an inmate who has been handcuffed, sitting down, shoving a rag down his throat, beating him upside the head, and stomping in his groin area, there is no state law or federal law where that is condoned whatsoever. And for somebody to say, you don't know the New York penal law, I actually pulled up, we looked at a bunch of things. What was it? Use of force for the state of New York, for corrections, for the New York City Police Department, state associations of chiefs of police, District Attorneys Association of the State of New York, Law Enforcement Training Directors Association, New York State Sheriff's Association, New York State University Police, and the New York Department of Corrections and Community Supervision. So, yeah, it's don't tell me that all of this stuff that I don't know what the New York penal law says, because I actually went through and looked up. And assault is assault, battery is battery, and what they did could be a tantamount to lethal force, unjustified lethal force. And since the guy died, yeah, that probably proves that there is no situation on God's green earth where New York penal code allows for any of that to happen. So, but people will talk out their ass as much as they want, and they'll think that they're right and true and morally higher than anybody else. But when you actually verify and you look at the laws and you point the laws in their direction, then it's like blah 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 blah. They don't care. They don't take the time. It's Facebook. It's social media. No one's actually going to take the time to look these things up. Unfortunately, I'm retired and I have time, and I do. And because I've been in law enforcement, because I've been in corrections, there's no, I don't know. It's just absolutely crazy. So anyway, that's what we got going on. I feel sorry for the inmates. I mean, if you're in prison because you did bad stuff. I don't feel sorry for that. You need to pay for what you did. There's consequences for your actions, but there's also consequences for your actions if you're a correctional officer and you do stupid shit like that. Yeah, I hope they all get sued, and we'll see. I'm assuming somebody will go to prison. I think those 3 guys that did the majority of it, and maybe the guys that helped carry him, definitely the guy that lifted him up by his neck, I think all of those guys are going to get, they're going to get some time. They'll try to do plea deals. I think somebody will go to prison for some amount of time, just on my own guesstimation. The other people, the other correctional officers that did not step in and stop this, by policy, they violated their department policy in the duty to care and so on and so forth. They will be let go. It'll just be a bad mark, and they'll be, you resign, and that'll be it. It'll be a done deal. But for the family of the inmate, I would be going after every single staff member that was there, medical staff, correctional officers, the whole 9 yards. I would be going after everybody because they stepped far outside the bounds, so there's not going to be that qualified immunity. So they can lose their house, their cars, their pensions. They can have, judgments and liens against their properties. It can just get really, really, really bad. And for the people that go to prison over this, they're going to have to pay some type of restitution. So they're going to pay. So, but yeah, there's some inmates that are monumentally stupid and knuckleheads, and that they will never learn. They'll never be law-abiding citizens. They are the worst of the worst, and they don't want to be a law-abiding citizen. Something's wrong, screwy in their head. Their moral compass is not off. It's totally been ripped out. Those people, they're in prison and they get what they deserve. But that doesn't mean that we as correctional officers or law enforcement go above and beyond the policy to break policy to punish those people even more because of what they did. If that's the case, you need to remove yourself from being a correctional officer or law enforcement and either move to another facility or just resign. That's what I'm saying. If you can't be professional, go somewhere else and be professional. But if you can't be professional as a whole, then you shouldn't be in law enforcement or corrections to begin with. So that's my 2 cents, my opinion. So anyway, that's what we got going on. It's going to be absolutely crazy to see what, and I imagine the thing that bothers me is that what type of manipulation and how this is going to be twisted, and are there going to be riots over this? I hope not. I really hope not. It's going to be absolutely crazy on what we end up seeing. That's another reason I like being retired overseas, and I'm retired here in Korea, and yeah, there's not a lot of this here in Korea. Yeah, imagine that. So anyway, that's what we got going on. It is coming up on the end of the year, and let's, follow the golden rule. Basically, what it comes down, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Of course, you have to have a good self-view about yourself, but if you were in prison, would you want to have excessive force against you? No. So why would you want to do excessive force against inmates who are somebody else's family member? It's just kind of simple. You got to just keep it simple, Just follow the policy. But the problem is a lot of people get that badge on and they get the chip on their shoulder and they think that, oh, I can get away with anything. And with these correctional officers, the 14 that got fired, or 13 or 14, one resigned, obviously they've been allowed to do this for a long period of time to where they thought this was okay. And the problem is that the guy died, and now it's getting national and worldwide attention. So put what you think in the description box down below, whether yay, nay, different, if you think I'm totally off base and inmates should be beat within, an inch of their life, regardless of laws and policies, put that down too. I don't agree with it. And the thing is that if you disagree with me, we can, and you have an opposing viewpoint, that's absolutely fine, but we can agree and disagree, but we can still remain mature and civil. Okay, so keep that in mind. No ad hominem attacks, no name calling and things like that. And especially if you haven't worked in law enforcement or corrections, maybe take what I say might hold some weight, after all the experience that I've had. And it's just put what you think in the description box. Anyway, that's going to be it. We'll see you on the next video. So take care. Peace.